A few years back, the company Colgate had to advertise their new line of dental floss. Everybody knows the company Colgate? Obviously not the most exciting product on the planet, but somebody has to do advertising for these kinds of products. So they hired a firm in Brazil to do their campaign. And I'm going to show you 3 ads from that campaign. Tell me what you notice in their ads. Here is ad number 1. And here is ad number 2. And here is ad number 3. What do you notice? Go for it. It's always the man that takes the hit with the food debris. That's very true, and more power to you guys. It takes people with lots of confidence to pull that off. So that's good. Go for it. Oh, there we go. Now we're starting to get a little bit closer to what's really happening. Beyond the obvious, everybody noticed the food debris, obviously. But let's look at these again. So as you're noticing in the upper left corner, how many fingers does she have? In the upper right corner, what's he missing? And the lower left, very much like you noticed, whose arm is that? So obviously the conclusion for their campaign was that the food debris captures our attention so much to the point where we're willing to overlook some Photoshop surprises. For us as cognitive neuroscientists, these types of campaigns and communication in general catch our own attention simply because they manage to do something that all of you here in the room aspire to doing at some point, which is attract people's attention long enough and stay on their memory long enough in order to influence decisions. Did it work for them? It sure did, because when they compare themselves against competition, which in this case is Crest, after the campaign they came up ahead. It's very exciting to be in the position to capture someone's attention and influence them when it counts. And that is the basis of our session for today. We're going to look at how we can capture some insights from brain science and use it in our communication methods, whether you're talking to somebody face-to-face or virtually, whether you talk to one person or 100, whether you talk to somebody professionally or personally. Can you manage to capture their attention and stay on their minds long enough to influence what they do next? It's exciting to look at brain science in general and bring in some of those insights into the way we communicate, because everyone in your audience, anyone that you're trying to persuade, has a brain. And I know that a few of you are smiling because you're wondering, well, sometimes I don't see the evidence of that. But essentially, when you're talking to people and you want to convince them of anything, you're addressing a multitude of neurons. And understanding how the brain processes information and how it remembers it, quite often not, is important in being persuasive. Do you ever wonder why human beings have a brain? What's that? To function in some way, hopefully function optimally, biologically optimally. Why else? Yeah.
Some people say it's a sickness.
Ooh, now we're starting to get into more philosophical debates. Having a brain is a sickness, is it?
It makes sense.
We have to discuss that. It's an interesting angle. It's a sickness that we want to heal, hopefully.
No, because if we didn't have a brain, we wouldn't be so rational, and we would just be an animal instinct, and we wouldn't do so much bad to humanity.
Oh, so he's mentioning that if we didn't have a brain, then we wouldn't be so rational. So you're equating having a brain with being more on the reasoning side. Too smart. Interesting. I like that perspective. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say a related thing, which is what makes us different than animals.
Being able to think, perhaps, and reason, which is what he's alluding to, yeah.
To survive, because those things, animal instincts, they are still in our brain, they're just not enough to control.
Yes, so she's concluding that ultimately we have a brain to survive, like you said, and functioning in an optimal way gets us there. Thinking at some point gets us there. Go for it.
I think similar to surviving by thriving, so it's either between predicting whether there'll be a threat or predicting whether there'll be more nourishment.
Ooh, I like where he's going after prediction. We have a brain so we can predict what happens next and hopefully go closer to a reward or away from a punishment. That's what you're going for. Yep. Feeling. We have a brain so we can feel and experience emotions. I love all of your answers. Yes. to communicate with each other. Yes, all of us here, the reason this is happening is because we all have brains, yes.
Process our senses.
To process our senses. Ooh, now we're getting close. Yeah, go for it. To ultimately survive, so you two are in unison. All of your answers are correct, and there is a very basic underlay under everything that you have just said. The very basic reason why we have a brain is so we can move. Think about it, and when he's going after the processing of the senses and for the function of it all, in the movement we communicate, and we can sometimes reason and sometimes feel things. The only reason why we have a brain is so we can move, and that's how we get to ultimately survive. A brain that does not enable us to move is not a brain that survives for too long. In fact, there's a creature out there at the bottom of the sea that once it finds its optimal spot for survival, it eats its own brain, simply because it doesn't have to move anymore. And I know that's a gory image if we think about it, but we have a brain so we can move. And in modern society, the brain hasn't changed much for the past 40,000 years. So in modern society, however, we have a lot of choices in our movement. We can move this way or we can move that way. And when you persuade others, you want at some point for people to move towards you. Anybody here who has a partner, anybody here who has a friend, at some point they became your partner or your friend because you convinced them in some way, consciously or not, to move towards you. And one of the main reasons why you're here is because at some point you would like to convince someone to make that movement, to go through that effort. So what we'll do for the rest of the session is we'll look at neuroscience to see what can we learn so that we can convince, we can persuade others to move towards us. It's exciting times when it comes to neuroscience. We're learning a lot, and one of the biggest epiphanies that we've had lately is that the brain does not move unless there is memory involved. We do not move unless we remember where to go. And I really loved your answer in terms of predicting, because sometimes we equate memory with remembering the past. That's retrospective memory, and that's true. And that's still helpful for us. But memory has really evolved to help us remember the future. Consider this as a shift in the way we look at movement. So I'd love for all of us here after the session to make memory your mission, because unless you stay on people's minds, it will be harder for you to influence where they move next. Since memory is at the root of all the movement and all decisions that the brain makes. The brain does not make any decision unless there's memory involved. Let's consider your situation. Can somebody give me an example of a decision that you have made lately? It doesn't matter how small or how large. Yeah, go for it.
What we wore today.
Oh, what you were wearing. So what made you decide to wear the gray and the black outfit? Kind of bluish.
I had to go to work, and this is an acceptable outfit to wear to work.
So she's saying, I decided my wardrobe based on the memory, what has been considered acceptable before. So there is memory involved, consciously or not, because you may have not necessarily given it a lot of thought, and she didn't have to spend a whole lot of cognitive energy making that decision. But through trial and error, we have learned what is appropriate and what is not, and the memory stays. The memory that gets us to reward, very much like he's saying. I like that example. There's somebody else who raised their hand. Any other decision you have made? Somebody said to come here. Yes.
I ate tea leaf salad today, and the memory I associate with it is very pleasant, crunchy salad, and it's very healthy.
There you go. So we choose what we eat based on memories of health and a pleasant taste or another pleasant memory. There's no decision that you ever make, consciously or not, unless there's some memory involved. So it goes without saying that if we want to convince people to move towards us, we have to figure ways in which to stay on people's minds, especially when memory is so fallible. Are you noticing the same things? Are you noticing how quickly we forget our lives? So let's do a test. For instance, if we were to analyze how quickly do we really forget things, imagine that Kim, who has helped us so graciously organize this, gave us a few $1 million, and I could put all of your brains in fMRI machines, and I would study your long-term memory. I would give you a test like this. So imagine right now that you are in an fMRI machine, something that looks like this. And I would show you a series of numbers, and I would ask you to recall as many numbers as you can without writing them down. And in between those numbers, you'll see some paragraphs of text. All you have to do is tell me if those paragraphs make sense, just with a simple yes or no. So here it goes. Remember this number, and now tell me if this statement makes sense, yes or no. I hear a few yeses. It might be a unanimous yes. Okay. Now let's keep in mind this number. And how about this statement? Yes or no? I hear a few strong no's and a few giggles. No context, maybe with a different context, we might accept it. Here's another number, please keep this one in mind. And how about this statement, yes or no? I hear some strong, you guys are fast processors of information. That's a fast answer, so we'll take that as a yes. Remember this number. And how about this statement, yes or no? Ooh, now we have a little debate going on. Some go with a yes, some go with a no. We could probably process it a little longer. How about this number? Keep this one in mind. And how about this? Yes or no? I hear a few more no's than yeses. And here's one more number to keep in mind. And how about this one? I hear a yes. Now we're getting philosophical. For the poets in the room, we'll accept that one as a yes. And here is one more number. Keep this one in mind. And now let's see who can help us recall the numbers in the order. Was it 53 or 52? So I think if we were to gather your responses and average them out, would you agree that in terms of accuracy, you're probably correct for the first 3 or 4 numbers that you're reflecting on? And imagine this exercise wasn't longer than a few minutes, and we already forgot most of the information that we were exposed to. What do our audiences do after we talk to them? We have this notion that whenever we share or we impart information is just so brilliant and so beautiful that surely people are going to remember. And unfortunately, they don't. Memory is so fallible. We forget our lives almost as quickly as we live them. That's why we have to reconsider some of our communication habits if we want to stay on people's minds so we can influence what they do next. Especially given that most people will forget 90% of what you share with them after 48 hours. And this statistic is a little bit different than what you may have heard before. Have you heard those stats that say we only remember 10% of what we see, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see and hear? Don't repeat those stats ever again. There is no scientific study out there that has proven such conveniently progressive statistics. All of you, I hear here, are very passionate about science as it's merged with some angle of consciousness. So you're very appreciative of something that is scientifically sound, and those are not. What I'm basing this statistic on is this theory and formula that has survived for about 100 years plus, which is called the forgetting curve, meaning that whenever whoever you're talking to comes to you and listens to you without the intent to remember, which if you're in business in any capacity, most of your audiences will be like that. They don't come to your information with the intent to remember. They come to your information with the intent to multitask. So whenever your audiences come to your information without the intent to remember, they forget fast at first and slower later. Meaning that after the first 48 hours, the forgetting curve has an exponential shape. Most of the forgetting will have happened in the first 2 days. And luckily though, the 10% there, we'll look at that as a metaphorical 10%. The little that stays there over time. So that's where our opportunity is to influence what people remember. But we have to ask another question though, because we know that the human memory is fallible and people will forget most of what you share. But at least the little that they remember, is it the right 10%? Because otherwise what we're noticing from science is that not only do people listen to you and they remember very little, but the little they remember is at random. So in other words, if I'm not careful about the 10% message that I want to put on your minds today, then the 10% that you remember will be different than the 10% that you remember will be different than the 10% that you remember, which means that I'm going to have a harder time convincing all of you to move towards some direction if all of you take away different things. I'm embarrassed to admit that a few months ago, I was attending a keynote presentation. After 45 minutes of listening to that person talking, the only thing that I remember is that he said that 17% of people in Italy believe it's okay to have sex and text at the same time. And I guarantee that if somebody had asked that person, what would you like people to remember after your talk, that would not have been his main message, the essence of what he wanted to impart with us. And should you remember that statistic from this presentation here, just make sure that you connected to the importance of controlling your 10%. That is a message that I'd love for you to take, which is be in control of the little that people remember. We look at that 10% as a metaphorical number because especially where business communication is concerned, which is my specialty, people will forget, will remember very little, but that little could be 11%, it could be 2%, sometimes it could be 0. I did a study about 2 years ago where I was concerned with how much do people really remember from PowerPoint presentations. And I exposed an audience to 20 slides, each slide having only one message, which as we know in business hardly ever happens. So after 48 hours out of the 20 slides, how much do you think people remembered? Yeah, exactly. So it was 2 or 3. I see that you were taking an average. On average, they remembered about 4 slides, so it was a little bit more than 10% because of the paucity of information. However, out of the 1,500 people who participated in that study, a third of my population, so 500 people, after 48 hours asked, what presentation? They remembered nothing, as if that just never happened. It was just good and relevant content too. Why do you think people forget so much, by the way? What makes you forget? Because you're not different than your audiences. What makes us forget? What's that?
Limited memory.
Limited, just like naturally, we may not have been born with some good capacity. Well, that's an interesting concept. And since some of us do have the propensity, I'm sure you know people who would know like 5 languages. How in the world do they know all that stuff? Yes.
If we remembered everything, we wouldn't know what direction to go.
Ooh, so he's saying if we remembered everything, we wouldn't know what direction to go. That's profound. So memory in some cases it's adaptive. We remember what serves us well. I like that. So when we give away the irrelevant, that's what you're after. Yeah, go for it.
Don't we mostly remember things that have emotions attached?
Ooh, now you're going after the feelings that he's talking about, for sure. So in addition to repetition, I'm sure that there is no secret to memory. Repetition is the mother of memory. No other variable is more studied in the literature of memory than emotions. You're definitely on the right track. Yep.
Do I really care about that?
Yeah. So that which is irrelevant, we don't remember that much. There was a line that I really liked. I heard the other day. Somebody was saying, "You weren't." I didn't really remember much because I just don't care, or you're good enough. I just didn't care. So you're absolutely right. You had an answer. Go for it. Yeah. Lack of salience. So that's very close to what he's saying. When something is irrelevant, it will be forgettable very, very quickly. Yep.
Something with a narrative or a story, so it's relevant because it's part of our construction of our story. Which has to do with, emotional relevance, but also like a willingness to participate in the information.
Yeah, so something that is more participatory, something that is packaged sometimes in a story, and the good story will have elements that you just listed, which is something that's relevant or something that is emotional. Yep.
Well, I think there's also an element to how we're listening. So when you're talking, right? But I am a sensory organism, and so in my mind, I'm like, I want to hear everything that you're saying, but at the same time, there's a sound over there that's now attracting my attention. There's
Yes.
this other thought that's passing through. I'm feeling the full air. And even though our mind is so much of what we're remembering, we're also having to remember all this other sensory input because we're still in the, am I in a safe place? Is it okay for me to be here? Like, how am I present and engaged in this conversation?
I really love her answer. She mentions all of the sensory input through which we take in the world, because ultimately how our memory is formed. They are formed by taking in all of this, using our senses to take in the world, and some may be competing with each other. And you're right, something might be louder and might be more interesting than what I'm saying, simply because it may impact your survival. I love what you're saying, because sensory information and the emotion, and sometimes even having something relevant which has to do more with the cognitive aspect of it, that's what storytelling is made of. And just know that simply packaging something in a story doesn't always make it memorable. There's another study that I did last year. I was asking this very question: are all stories memorable? And the answer is no, we still forget stories. But if we have all of these elements that you're mentioning, such as strong sensory information, strong feelings, even strong cognitive elements, sometimes I hear people speak about stories versus facts. Facts are just zoomed in stories. You still need some factual information and some cognitive elements in order to make a story. So overall, you're totally correct. We forget because something is irrelevant, because something is competing with something else, and therefore we deviate our attention from it. We also forget, by the way, because so many pieces of information are like other pieces of information, to the point that after a while, you don't know which one was which. Yeah, go for it. I think you had, did you have a... Yeah, something that deviates from a pattern that you have learned to expect could also become memorable simply because now you have a heightened sense of attention. Sometimes I work with companies here in the Silicon Valley that are in the field of predictive analytics, for instance, since you're talking about predictions. And if I look at one company's message, and then I look at somebody else's, and then somebody else's, and somebody else's, after a while, they're all saying the same things. And when that happens, guess what the brain remembers? It will remember some sort of gist information, and it will give credit to the more familiar source. So if we're not careful, you're actually giving somebody else's presentation, you're delivering somebody else's message, and somebody else can get the credit. That really hurts. You will feel it right here when you have put a lot of effort into something and it's not distinct enough, very much like you're saying. So there are all of these reasons that we're forgetting. Now, I like what you're going for. Forgetting has some evolutionary value because if we remembered everything, we would be in so much trouble. You couldn't be married. You couldn't have customers if people remembered everything that you said or did. So memory and forgetting are part of the same coin. You're remembering something at the expense of ignoring something else. And sometimes it's good for our evolution to ignore some of the things that are not serving us well. So one of the questions that I'd love for all of you to ask as you move away from here, regardless of what you're working on, whether you're still in school and you're working on something that's important to you, whether you have a customer that you want to impress, whether you have a business that you want to grow, always start with the question, what is my 10%? What is that metaphorical 10%? Because otherwise, unless you're in control of something, people will take away disparate things. I've started doing these studies where I use a mobile EEG headset. Have you guys seen these? The EEG headset, you might be familiar with the technology. We now have the capability to put these electrodes on people's scalps, and as the brain is exposed to information, when the neurons connect and communicate with each other, they generate some electrical activity in the brain. And these electrodes have enough of an amplification system inside of them where they can read some of these brain waves. And we now have the ability to connect these brain waves with cognitive capacity. So I know what's happening in your brain at the time that you're exposed to stimulation. This is so rewarding because if I study your memory, I don't just have to simply ask what you remember. I can monitor what's happening in your brain at the time that you're exposed to stimulation. So that's why it's so cool to look at communication in general from the standpoint of brain science. We start from the angle of memory. Sometimes we know that the reason people forget is because our audiences don't pay attention to begin with. Very much like you said, we're constantly distracted. Does anybody have a good example of extreme distraction and multitasking, other than texting and driving? Facebook, that we now overlap with other tasks. Yes, go for it. Group chats, and some things are happening here, and some things are happening here, and all of these are happening all at once. What else? Yep.
Texting during sex.
Oh, 17%. Somebody's paying attention. Yes, yes, yes. We tend to overlap more and more things. There's this word that I learned just recently, which is phubbing, P-H-U-G-G-I-N-G. Have you guys heard of phubbing? It means maintaining eye contact while texting. We have gotten so good at this socially because we sometimes feel guilty for it. So now there is actually a verb that it's crazy. So no wonder we forget so much because attention is a precursor to memory. It's a lot easier for you to be memorable if somebody's paying attention to you versus not. Is it possible for the brain to remember something even if they don't pay attention? The answer is yes. It's nice to get people to pay attention. And unfortunately, these days we have to change some of our habits because there's less and less of it, or the brain is more and more tempted to overlap tasks. I was interviewed just recently by a TV station. This was somewhere in Australia. And we were talking about attention and memory and how it influences decision making, all of this. And I was mentioning this app that I came across, which is called Email and Walk. And the app turns on your camera on your phone so that as you're walking, you can actually see where you're going when you're typing your text, because so many people have been falling into manholes and have been tripping on things. So email and walk is a popular app. So talking about the detriment of this and the positive of attention, and as we're having this interview, what is the number one question that people are asking calling into this radio station? How to get this app. They now want to know how to get this app, even though that was not the point. That was not the point. So attention is a precursor to memory. If you have attention, you have memory. If you have memory, you're more likely to have decision making. You're more likely to convince the brain to move towards you. So let's look at some of these segments, because when you have all three, these three pillars, by the way, are the pillars of any modern communicator, any modern leader. And the reason that you're here is because you too are leading your space in some way. Otherwise, you wouldn't be present. So always start with this question: what would you really like people to remember? Many of us aspire at being memorable. Very few of us know what we want to be memorable for. This is why I love the exercise that you have on your stickers, because reflecting on what you want to put on people's minds is going to be one of the most satisfying things that you can do. And why is that? Because if you manage to stay on somebody's mind, you will live longer. Think about it. When you stay on somebody else's minds, you literally prolong your longevity in some way. So always find this clarity. As we work with a lot of CEOs in our business, for example, or different executives, different people who have something to communicate, I'm noticing that by far the biggest mistake that people make is not having the clarity of what they want to put in others' minds. And the luxury too, because it's a luxury to reside on somebody else's brain. And it's getting harder because there's no paucity of information these days. There's over and over. I'm surprised that none of you mentioned why is it that we forget? We forget because there's just so much darn information around us. There's a lot that is happening, and to get people to clarity in the background of this abundance is starting to become harder and harder. Get to the clarity of your message and you have an increased chance of being memorable. Sometimes if we were to just simply reflect on the world of presentations, which is quite often our world, we recreate people's messaging and presentations. People believe that having a well-organized agenda surely is their 10% message. But that's not the case. Even as you're watching this example, just because you organize things in bullet points doesn't mean that you're in charge of a message that the brain remembers. Simply even having the word agenda is a prompt, must be a prompt for all of you here if you're ever doing agendas for any sort, to think, what is really my 10% message? What do I want to put on people's minds? Because the brain has energy for rewards, not for agendas and not for topics. I constantly look for good examples of 10% messages. Sometimes I find them beyond the world of business. Has anybody seen this book? I see that a few of you are smiling. Perhaps you know him. He teaches here, I think, at UC Berkeley. Brilliant writer. But what I enjoy about him is that he takes a complex field such as eating and dieting, and he manages to distill it down to something that we can all master. His 10% message is that I'm defending food, and it's great to eat. We all love eating. It's good to eat. So we already accepted this message. And to this, he has 3 supporting points. He says, eat food, not too much, mainly plants. We don't necessarily have to agree with this message, but notice how it's easy to take it to the grocery store, and if we did, we could do very well there. How often do our messages, especially in our school work or in our business work or even out in our personal work, can come down to this kind of simplicity and this kind of ease that can stay on people's minds? Because you see, the brain is a cognitively lazy organ. There's no easy way of saying it. Given the choice to think or not to think, what do we prefer? We prefer not to think. The brain is constantly looking for ways to conserve energy, because in that movement that it helps us make in order to survive, very much like you said, our brain consumes a lot of energy. So any chance it finds to conserve it, it will take it, which is why people will fall asleep in presentations. Any chance you find to conserve energy, cognitive energy, you will take it. So that's why we constantly look for cognitive ease. So whenever you want to stay on people's minds, ask this question. Not only what is my 10%, but is my 10% coming to mind easily? Very much like he's doing here. Sometimes I get the question, well, if people only remember 10%, let's just give them the 10% and not even worry about the rest. Send them a text message or a PDF file, that would be good enough. And to that answer, I'm reminding people, well, if you don't have the 90, hardly the 10 will stand out. So you need the 90 as a sidekick to the 10. But because memory needs sidekicks. If everything is competing for our attention, nothing really gets it. But there's also another question that I get, which is, what do I do if I want people to remember more than 10%? Is it possible to get the brain to remember maybe 5 things or maybe 14 things? And yeah, sure, it's possible. With enough repetition and the strong emotion, very much like you said earlier, we can make something memorable that's a lot more abundant. But do you want to? That's what we have to reflect on, because here's the situation with the brain. Let's just say that all of you here in the room were BMW owners. And you came to this room, and I would give you a piece of paper, and I would say, write 10 reasons why you have a BMW. So you would write down your reasons, and then I would ask you a subsequent question. I would say, why do you have a BMW, and how much do you like it? And we're noticing that people who give more reasons for owning that car also report liking their car less. I know it's a counterintuitive finding, but think about it. What happens in your brain is this: as you're listing reasons 1 through 4, those come to mind easily, cognitive ease. 5 through 7, now you have to exert a little bit more effort. It's not impossible, but you have to work a little harder. Anything beyond 7, now you really have to work. So by the time I'm asking you, how much do you like this car, you hate it altogether. So that's why it's not always so advisable that you enable your audiences, people in your personal or professional lives, to remember more things that you think are important. Enable them to remember fewer things that come to mind easily. Cognitive ease. We're constantly after cognitive ease. Look at our political spectrum. Or maybe not, because we're talking about emotions, so maybe we don't want to be so... But if you think about it, election time, if you had to stop people on the street, let's just say 100 people, and you said, Hillary's message, go. And then you stopped 100 people on the street and you said, Trump's message, go. Which message would have come to mind more easily? And then we wonder why people move in a certain direction, because the brain makes decisions on that which it remembers, and it tends to remember things that come to mind easily, simply because we constantly look for ways in which we can conserve energy. So that's why, as you reflect on your own 10% messages, whatever your situation is or hope is to make something memorable, ask this: do I have the clarity of that 10% message, and do I make it come to mind easily? Do I enable cognitive ease? I was working with a client not too long ago, and they were saying, we want people to remember the fact that our technology is modularly versatile. And I was just thinking, nobody speaks that way. That phrase is not going to come to mind easily in any shape or form, in any context that you're thinking. And we're not going to sit down at dinner and say, you have to buy this technology because it is so modularly versatile. It's even hard to say, especially if you're a foreigner or your English is not your native language. So if my 10% for you for this session is make sure that you control yours, you cannot control something unless you determine what that is. So be sure that you have the clarity of that message and you enable cognitive ease. You make it come to mind easily. And because our time together today is fairly short, out of these 3, let's focus on attention a little bit more, because we know that attention paves the way to memory. And these days, fewer and fewer people are willing to give it. I'm noticing sometimes, do you observe Uber drivers or drivers in general, or you're talking about texting and multitasking? I'm seeing just extreme cases of these where people, I saw this guy that was doing horse betting I'm surprised that he was using pen and paper, but with one hand he was driving, and on the other he had on his knee these papers, and he was circling the horses that he thought would be appropriate for winning. People are watching soccer games, they're watching all sorts of things when they're driving. Driving and texting is almost like 1997. Now you have to put a few more things. There was one guy who texted me the other day from the top of a roller coaster. So we have now enough capacity in our brains to squeeze in just one more thing in terms of attention, in terms of stimulation. Using brain science, by the way, we can debunk a lot of myths. And one such myth is that we have a decreased attention span. Have you heard this before? People are saying our attention span has decreased. Don't repeat that either. Because the brain has not changed much in the past 40,000 years. We are capable of prolonged attention spans. How many of you have watched Avatar in here? So look at you, almost everybody here has watched Avatar. How about The Martian? Have you seen The Martian? Almost everybody, well, about 50% of you. Would we recommend it, perhaps? Those 2 movies are 3-hour-long movies. How many of you got up to make a sandwich during those movies? And there are some exceptions. Some people might say, oh, I kind of got hungry midway. It's just I kind of had enough. But for most part, people stay focused for 3 hours to see what happens next. We are capable of prolonged periods of attention. The brain is capable of staying focused. So that has not changed. Our attention span has not decreased. However, what has changed is our threshold for stimulation. These days, unless we are stimulated more and more frequently in shorter spurts, which our hands start trembling, we have to reach for some devices that give us stimulation, or else our threshold for stimulation has changed. If we were to look at movies, and we can learn a lot from Hollywood, because as a business, they don't have it easy. They have to sustain your focus for at least 90 minutes, and quite often in the dark. That's not an easy proposition. So they do a lot of studies, and they look, what does it take these days to keep people engaged, to keep them focused? Look at the average shot length. Yeah, so see, you know, for movies, 1930s, 1940s, what was the average shot length for a movie? Yeah, so one of those embracing scenes where things are happening very slowly and not a whole lot going on, those would be about 30, 40 seconds for a scene, easily. What's the average shot length for movies today? So it's 3 seconds, you're showing 4, 2-ish, so if we had to take an average, it would be somewhere around between 3 and 4 seconds. Born Supremacy, have you guys seen those movies, those trilogies? Born Supremacy, average shot length for Born Supremacy is 2.8 seconds. There's some things that are happening so fast that your conscious brain is almost not even able to process it. So fast. And not only are they shorter, but there's a whole lot of motion that is happening. So we're going now for short segments that have a lot of animation and a lot of motion, and that's what the modern brain is used to seeing. So you see, in its personal life, it's used to this level of stimulation, but then when you go to school or when you go to work or in some boring kind of setups, and nothing really is happening, no wonder we start reaching for the phone, because we want to be stimulated in more and more abundance. When was the last time that you really sat down and did nothing? Other than right now, so I'm very grateful. And you guys are a good group speaking about consciousness and meditation. We can learn a lot from you because, biologically speaking, there's very little evolutionary value in the present. I know this is a tough statement to make, so I'll say it again and then we can discuss it. There's very little evolutionary value in the present. Think about it, and he said it very correctly earlier on in the presentation. The brain has been designed to be constantly on fast forward. The brain that survives has to be the brain that predicts what happens next, that predicts where to move next. So it's constantly on fast forward, and how does it know which path to take? It knows based on past memories that now it recalls so that it can predict what's the best path, and the path of least resistance, the one with cognitive ease. Very little evolutionary value in the present. And I know that, I'm assuming that most of you here meditate given the nature of your group. Is that true? So some of you, yes or no. But would you agree that the first time that you tried it, it was one of the most difficult things that you have ever done? And that's because you're asking the brain to do something that naturally it's not designed to do. And it gets easier with time because of practice, obviously. But we can learn a lot from you, and the deepest admiration for those who can indeed do it, because otherwise it's very difficult to keep the brain here. That's why the best kind of communication, by the way, is the one where you're helping an audience predict where to go next. So that's what we'll address, because if you want to get somebody's attention, can you help them be familiar with what happens in the next moment? And usually you can help people like that if you help them build mental schemas or models. You see, the brain, as we process our environment and as we use our senses, we're constantly building mental models or schemas for how to interpret our reality. If we didn't have our templates, life would be so darn hard. Because imagine, we have mental schemas for almost everything we go through. When you go to the airport, you kind of know how things are happening. When you go to a business meeting or to a gathering like this, you kind of know what to expect. Do you ever go to the grocery store and they switch things on you? Now that's because somebody has messed with the cognitive mental model that you have about that place. We love mental schemas because they help us conserve energy. It would be so exhausting if we had to interpret our environment as new every single time. Notice what happens if I mess with the linguistic schema, and I already did it earlier in the exercise. I guarantee that as you're reading this sentence here on the screen, what's happening in your brain is you have to read it a few times until you finally are able to fit it within an existing mental schema. Is that true? And that means I'm asking your brains to then expand a little bit more cognitive energy than I need to. So we have to be cautious, because sometimes the reason we're forgettable is because our mental schemas that are very clear in our minds don't match with what an audience knows what to expect. You see, another beautiful thing about mental schemas is not only do they help us conserve energy, but they help us predict because they invoke familiarity. Quite often we like to portray ourselves as novelty seekers and being risky and on the edge. But given the choice between familiarity and novelty, what is it really that you prefer? So if we were to take those millions that Kim is giving us to do the fMRI study, and I put your brains in there, and I would flash a set of pictures in front of your eyes so fast that your conscious brain could not detect them. Anything under 250 milliseconds would do the trick. And then outside of the scanner, I would give you two sets of pictures to look at. The one that you saw in the scanner but don't know it, and the new set of pictures, and I would ask you, which ones of these do you prefer? What do you choose, familiarity or novelty? Exactly, you choose familiarity simply because you don't have to think so much, cognitive ease. The brain is a cognitively lazy organ. So if we want to get somebody's attention, can we hook what we say into an existing mental model? Because attention already expanded to something that you already know. Do you ever buy a car and suddenly everybody on the highway is driving the exact same darn car that you just bought? It's not that all of a sudden there are more cars and more people are buying what you just bought. Your attention has expanded. Your mental model now includes something that feels familiar to you. So what mental model are you sharing with your audience? And an audience doesn't have to be big. It could be simply your spouse or your friend that you're trying to persuade to move in a specific direction. The more the mental models match, the easier it is to get somebody's attention. And if you have attention, you have memory. If you have memory, you're more likely to have decision making. Do you ever listen to him speak, the Dalai Lama? So I see that some of you have heard him, maybe you have seen him in person. Every so often when he delivers speeches, especially to large audiences, he brings his translator, which is the person that you're seeing here on stage. And in this particular case, he's talking to about 2,000 people. And in that situation, he feels a little bit cautious about his English skills. This is why the translator is there. So he starts talking about a specific topic, and he talks for about 2 minutes. And now the audience is waiting for him to pause and the translator to pick up and tell us what he just said in his own native language. But he doesn't stop. He goes on, and 2 more minutes go by, and then 5 minutes, and he still hasn't stopped. And that guy hasn't said a word, and he hasn't taken any notes. 10 minutes into this thing, he's still talking, he's not writing anything down. And now you can feel people fidgeting. And you can feel 2,000 people fidgeting. 15 minutes into this thing, finally he stops and he starts picking up what was just said. And of course we have to trust that what he's saying is true. But you would think that at those levels they don't really lie. So after the presentation is over, journalists are rushing to the stage not to talk to the celebrity. They want to talk to this guy because they want to know how in the world was he able to perform such a feast of memory. When you saw earlier on when we did our exercise, 2 minutes later, we have no idea what some of those numbers were or some of those segments that we just listened to. Forget our lives almost as quickly as we live them. So he's answering the journalist's questions, how in the world are you able to do this, with a simple answer. He says, he and I are sharing the same mental model. When he starts talking, I know exactly what in his mind he is given that particular topic. Our mental models match, which is why he can get away with speaking for that long, and he can get away with not really taking any notes because the two are the same. And unfortunately, quite often, and especially in business, we're observing this, but sometimes even in our personal lives, when the two mental models do not match, that's when we can really claim a lot of attention. You may have heard the saying, why is it that the wife did not enjoy the trip to Paris that the husband surprised her with? It's because that's not what she wanted. So the two mental models were totally different. And if you ever got into an argument with someone, or you're trying to persuade them to move in a certain direction and they didn't want to go, it's because you had one mental model and they had a different mental model. So if you want to be memorable, ask this: do I share the same mental model with those that I'm trying to convince to move into a specific direction? And that's when you have increased chances. Now, a mental model can only carry us so far, because if we insist too much on familiarity, the brain after a while habituates. And what do I mean by this? If I expose you to too much of the same information, you will pay attention at first, and expanded attention and such, but after a while, you just get habituated to it, so you no longer pay attention. Imagine this, let's just say that you go to your office or to a school or to whatever environment in the morning and you hear some music in the background. At first, that music track will capture your attention, but after a while, it will do just that. It will fall into the background. Give me some examples to some things that you have habituated to in your offices. Yep.
My alarm clock.
So the alarm clock in the morning, you mean? That's great. I love that. So imagine the alarm clock is designed to grab our attention, and these days we don't even hear it that much anymore. That's funny. Wait, go for it. A cuckoo clock. So it's amazing because they're going for the sound. So some of these sounds have been designed to do the opposite, and after a while we just ignore them. What else do you habituate to? Yeah.
Clothes on your body.
The clothes on your body, like just even feeling the sensation. Yeah, especially if you're wearing, do you ever put on some jeans and they're a little tight at first, but after a while you don't even notice that anymore? Yep, go for it. Yeah, so that even in here, if we were to be really quiet, we would hear it, but how many of you just minutes ago you're thinking, you know, I'm really hearing that air conditioning unit? Yep.
Smell.
Oh, even the scent.
Almost any smell ultimately habituate to unless it's horrible.
Yes, yes, odors, yeah. Thank God that we habituate to some of those, really. The lunchtime, in terms of when it comes? Yeah, I said we don't really notice it anymore. Like sometimes it may be 2 o'clock and you're thinking, oh shit, where did it go? Yep, go for it.
Stop signs.
Oh, stop signs. Some of these signs are there for just a suggestion, not necessarily to be respected. I like that.
The concept of monitors.
The concept of monitors. Oh, like now we have 2 or 3 or 4. I've seen people 4.
Is that there's one there at all?
Oh, interesting. So we're not even noticing the technology, and those manufacturers would love for you to hear, to love to hear that you're saying this, because that is the mantra for some technology people, is make the device seamless, make it seem like it's not even there. So that's a good job for them. I love all of your examples, and what they have in common is that at first they capture our attention, but after a while they fall into the background. And from an evolutionary perspective, it's good that the brain habituates, because otherwise you'd go nuts. You'll go crazy if you had to pay attention to all this air conditioning, or sometimes we have lights that have a buzz. Even to your own breathing. Imagine if you couldn't habituate to the sound of your own breathing. You go crazy. So it's good that the brain habituates. However, after a while, habituation has some detriments, and I'll address those. These days, we know so much about habituation. We can look in the brain and we can discover where are our habits really stored. And they're stored in this area that you see listed here on the screen. The striatum obviously has some other functions. It doesn't just house our habits, but do you ever feel a vibration on your leg and your phone is not even there? That's where that habit is housed right there. So we learn a lot about habits, and what we know is that the brain habituates so darn fast. So even though from an evolutionary perspective, yeah, it's good that we habituate, but it happens so quickly. Take communication, for instance. In the beginning, we were so happy to communicate face to face, and then we habituated to that means. And then we wanted a little bit more, because you see, we don't just habituate to stimulation and to perceptions, we habituate to the rewards that we get from that perception and from that stimulation. So that's where even where communication is concerned, we developed a little bit more, and then we habituated, and then we wanted some other means of communication, and we habituated to those, to the point where these days, if you're at 40,000 feet in the air and your internet connection goes down, life is over as you know it, because we habituate to those rewards. Give me some of your own examples. What are some things that you used to consider so new and so fresh and so rewarding, and now it's just like, whatever? What are some rewards that you have habituated to? Yes.
Oh, okay. Technology.
Yes, so some technology like the that was like video chat. Yeah, so of course you're able to see somebody in real time. Like what's the big deal? Taking a lift, taking the elevator up is like. Oh, yes, yeah, all of a sudden I have my own private driver at these fingertips. Of course you do, yes.
Eating sugar.
Eating sugar, oh, that's interesting. Yes, so you have habituated to that taste, and now?
Yeah, like when you're a kid, it's a big deal to eat sugar.
Yeah.
And then when you're an adult, you just kind of eat it.
It's like, of course it's there, and nobody can stop me because I'm an adult now. I like that, yeah, go for it. Marriage. Ooh, so now it's getting profound, because we habituate to rewards and to the people who provide us those rewards, and sometimes we take them for granted. Yes, go for it.
When you live on a boat, after about a day, you get used to it, and you get back on the land.
And things start shifting. So living on a boat and then transitioning to land afterwards, that perceptual change is going to capture our attention. Yes?
I used to live in Chicago,
So imagine living in Chicago or any kind of a big metropolitan area, like going to New York. New York, I hear, is even worse. But after a while, people do habituate to those sounds. And then they go to the countryside, and then you can't sleep there because now you need to have that stimulation. Yes, go for it.
Being healthy. So like when you're really sick, you're like, I will pay anything just to be healthy. But then once you're healthy, you're like, yeah.
Yes, being healthy versus being sick. I like that. And I think there was somebody else. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, essentially any purchase that we make that we anticipate and get excited about, it could be whatever treat at whatever.
Yes, so imagine buying something and the first day that you're wearing those shoes or you're wearing that jacket or you're wearing those clothes that you're talking about, it's like, oh, this is the greatest thing on the planet. And after a while, it just lays on the floor or on an armchair. Someone's like, yeah, of course I have to have it. The brain habituates so fast. We habituate to rewards. So then you as communicators are at this crossroads of merging something that feels familiar to the brain to something that jars it off just ever so slightly. And I really like what this bookstore does in Israel. This is a bookstore, and just like any bookstore, what do they want? They want people to go into the store and buy the books. And notice how they did their advertising, merging very cleverly something that you find familiar with something that is a little bit of a twist. So that's a responsibility that all of us have if we aspire at attention. Can we have a good balance between familiarity and surprise? And we have to define the terms because sometimes people use novelty and surprise as interchangeable, but they're not. Novelty is something that you haven't seen or heard before, whereas surprise is something that you have seen and heard before, but you did not expect. So see, as you see an example like this, it's not like you haven't seen those elements before in your life, but the merger of them is something that was less predictable. And remember, the brain is designed to not miss anything. We're constantly looking for ways to predict what happens next. And what is surprise but a prediction error? Think about that for a moment. The surprise is a prediction error. Whenever your brain is surprised, that means it failed to predict what you would see or what you would hear next. And from that regard, really, biologically speaking, surprise is always bad. And I know that too is a strong statement, and the reason it's bad is because it signifies to your brain that it was not able to predict. However, the reason we accept it and we enjoy surprises, not only because in the process of processing a surprise, there are some chemicals that are released in your brain, some of which you really enjoy it because they're opiates. And if we're all able to bottle those, none of us would be here. You'd be at cocktail tropics, sipping cocktails with the little umbrellas in them. If you were able to bottle some substances that the brain has naturally released. So we enjoy surprises from that reason, but we also enjoy surprises because the gap between what you expect and what happens in reality is how the brain learns. I'll say it again, the gap between what happens in reality and what you expected is how the brain learns. That's why we seek surprises and we enjoy them. So can you be a good choreographer between something that is familiar to your audience and something that they did not expect? Some freedom that you provide them within a framework. Take the Mona Lisa, for instance. If you were to go to Google and type in Mona Lisa variations, you would see her in all sorts of different circumstances, with all sorts of different accessories, portrayed in all sorts of different ways. And the only reason why you may laugh at some of these segments is because you're familiar with the original. And somebody has had the courage, in some cases the audacity, of twisting a pattern that you learned to expect, which was one of your answers when I was saying, well, what is memorable? And you said it's something unique, something that deviates from a pattern. Can you be the choreographer of that? Familiarity plus surprise. And the ratio that you offer it to your audiences is up to you. Because think of it this way, too much familiarity and you will be boring. Too much surprise and you will be weird. So there's a balance that you have to achieve between these, and the more you're talking to risk-taking audiences, for instance, you can jar their brain a little bit more and twist it a little bit more with an element of surprise. But even a small segment of surprise is sufficient to take the brain out of its habituation, which is the point of all of this. So what would be your framework, and what freedoms can you take within that so you don't allow the brain to habituate? That's the first point. I have just a few more points before we leave, but so far, any kind of questions or epiphanies that you've had or something that's on your mind as you're listening to this? Yes?
How do you define familiarity?
Familiarity is defined through that lens of a mental model that exists for your audience. And you're absolutely right to say that it's different for everybody because everybody would have their own mental model. And often then to say, well, what do people consider familiar? To simply ask. Ask, what is it that they know to be true? Yes.
How many roughly mental models does the average human carry around?
Ooh, what a question. How many roughly mental models do we have about the world around us? It has to be. Does anybody want to take a guess? I don't know that anybody has ever numbered this, but I love the question. What would you say?
7 plus or minus 2.
I like that. And for those of you who know about the 7 plus or minus 2, this goes back to 1950s, where was it Miller who came up with this model. He was telling people that as they process, especially lists, you're more likely to remember one that has 7 plus or minus 2 items. So I don't know that the mental models would have to fit within that, but through our life, I mean, imagine just as you wake up in the morning, how many expectations do you have of the world around you? And I would love for some of you to count if you wanted to. Do you expect your slippers to be in a certain way? Do you expect your body and the temperature to be a certain way? Do you expect the bathroom door to be in a specific location? Do you expect to find the clothes that you have set forth to? I would say millions. If you had to start counting, yes. I love that question.
Are we reaching a limit? Because we were talking about the films and all those shortcuts, right?
Yes.
To keep memory and things interesting. I mean, everybody's doing it now. So nothing's interesting. It's all the same. It's all the special effects and everything.
Yes, and what do we do in front of the sea of similarity? Because so many people are doing the same things. But see, there's an advantage to that. So don't be so concerned that so many people are saying the same things or are doing the same things, because in order for your audience's brains to detect differences, they have to detect some similarity. So if you want to have something that is distinct, observe patterns of similarity that are happening in your people's worlds, observe their mental model, and only then deviate. Because otherwise, if we don't have something that looks the same, how do we know that something is really different? We often need the contrast between the two. Yes? Ooh, I like this. So how does intelligence play into this equation of memory? There are a few correlations that we can make, because whenever you're exposed to stimulation, you process the world through your senses, very much like you said, and we form a sensory memory. So as you enter a space, you kind of feel the world around you. You might feel it through your sense of touch, visual, auditory. And by the way, for those people who say, oh, I'm more of an auditory person, that's a little bit more of a BS statement, because biologically speaking, 60 to 70% of your body receptors are visual. So you cannot go wrong with influencing somebody's memory by painting mental pictures in their minds. And this begs another question, and I'll come back to yours. What's more memorable, pictures or text? And intuitively, we tend to say pictures because we can immediately see a picture, so obviously that appeals to our visual senses. But if I were to say to you, climbing Mount Everest is like running on a treadmill, breathing through a straw. See how I have painted the picture in your mind without showing you any picture. I didn't have to show you a PowerPoint slide with that image. And yet you can use words that paint a mental picture in your audience's brain. So don't put so much pressure on yourselves thinking that I always have to show my audiences these amazing visuals, and I'm not even a graphic designer, because just simply choosing words that build a mental image in people's brains can help you become memorable. The way that intelligence plays into this is as we take our world in through our senses, that sensory memory is gone almost within a fraction of a second. Without looking, how many windows are in this space? So he's kind of guessing 10. Now that we look, we see some here, there are some upstairs that you didn't see as you're coming in. So you see, you enter a space and you forget your world almost as quickly as you live in it, simply because some of that information is irrelevant. If all of you were here in the army, you would have known the answer to that question instantly, because you're trained to look for those kinds of things, so your sensory memory is different. So our sensory memory disappears. However, a few things do stay in your mind in your short-term or working memory. And that working memory lasts between 30 seconds, 40 seconds to a minute. For intelligent people like you guys, 2 minutes max. That's your short-term or working memory. And that's the correlation that we have with intelligence. We're noticing that people with a higher IQ have a longer span for their short-term or working memory. And this is why you may notice that people with high IQs are also funny people, Because quite often in humor, what makes something funny but a callback, recalling something that just happened minutes ago. And most of us average people forget those very quickly, yet people with a higher IQ tend to keep those in their working memory. Yeah, there was another question, yes.
I'm just thinking about the Michael Pollan slogan again, the book, and I'm wondering, like, how do you balance, like kind of just being really reductive, you know, something
Yes.
that's like kind of too simple to actually be meaningful. I agree that that's an effective slogan,
Yes.
but there's so much nuance in, for example, Michael Pollan's reading the book, you know, like how do you balance this?
I love her question so much. So she's saying, at what point are we too reductive in our messaging and we simplify, and in that process we almost become simplistic? I think that's the point you're after.
Really transcending the experience.
And you're not imparting essentially the essence of an experience, which could be important as well. But here's the thing. So remember how we're saying, are you the choreographer of familiarity and surprise? Here's another choreography that you have to master if you're attempting to become memorable. And that's something that she's alluding to, which is this balance between something that is simple versus something that is complex. And you couldn't help us more but transition to the next section, because that is the perfect way to segue in some things that I have prepared for you. So I'm going to get to that because I think you're bringing such a good point. Yeah, cognitive ease is so juicy to the brain, but at some point, is complexity memorable? And you'll be surprised by the answer. So let's look at the segment, because I think you'll like it. Let's see what's happening in here. This is no longer helping us.
Surprise.
That's an element of surprise. We will be right back after these messages. Let's, yeah, here we go. We woke it up from its habituation. So since we're talking about habituation, you probably are wondering, what really happens in terms of neuroscientific angles in the brain as we habituate? And the answer has to do with this neurochemical, and I'm certain that every single person here in this room has heard of this neurotransmitter before. Is that true? Yes. So I mean neurotransmitters, what do I mean by this? Is it's chemicals that get released as our neurons communicate and talk to each other. This neurotransmitter has been so widely talked about in literature and in research to the point where we're calling it the Kim Kardashian of neurotransmitters, which I don't think is fair to dopamine. But we used to believe as neuroscientists that dopamine has to do with something that you crave and something that you like. But the newer finding is a little bit different. Tell me some things that you crave, some things that you like. Chocolate. Sex, somebody said beauty, yes, yes, we like that. Nobody's mentioning alcohol, so that's good. Or maybe you're thinking about it. So yeah, there's some things that we really crave, and what we're noticing, the newer findings are these. You don't have to have dopamine in your brain in order to like chocolate. You have to have dopamine in your brain to go get it. So now we're associating the presence of that chemical with efforts. And this is what it's serving us well to find out how in the world can we generate it in our audience's brains, the ones that we're trying to persuade to move towards us. Because the more abundance this chemical has in our brain, the more likely we are to move, the more likely we are to make that effort. And how do we know this? Let's just say that you take a rat, you teach the rat to press a lever, and then you also identify an area in the rat's brain that secretes dopamine, and you put an electrode there, such that each time that the rat presses this lever, it gets excited in that area and dopamine gets released. And because obviously dopamine still makes you feel good, the rat is willing to go through this effort, and it's effortful for a rat to do this motion. He tends to do it over and over and over until it dies. Not a bad way to go for the rat, because you have felt very good in the process. But this is where we're noticing that dopamine is related to drive. Dopamine is related to action. How else can we prove some of these things? Let's just say that you take a monkey and you also are teaching it to press a lever, and as a result it gets a reward, which in this case is bananas that the monkey likes. So having the anticipation of that reward is good, so it's willing to go through that effort. And obviously the dopamine will go in some level, so at least it exists. But we're noticing something else. Let's just say that in the room where you have this experiment with the lever and the reward, and you put a signal that now announces that something exciting is about to happen. The monkey hasn't pressed the lever yet, it hasn't received the reward yet, but there is just the anticipation of something that's happening. And notice what happens to the dopamine level. So see, you're noticing that dopamine is not so much about the effort in itself, sometimes it's about the anticipation of pleasure that you're going to have. How often do you create anticipation for your audiences? Do you ever plan a trip and the planning of a trip is more exciting than the trip itself? That's because that chemical is in more abundance in your brain at the time of planning, because now you're in the exciting stage, something good is about to happen even though it hasn't happened just yet. And we're finding out something even more precious than this. We asked the question, what happens if we don't give the reward every single time? What happens if the monkey goes to the effort and sometimes it gets the bananas, and sometimes it goes to the effort and gets nothing? What happens then? And we tried it with different percentages, like maybe you give the reward 25% of the time, maybe you give the reward 75% of the time. When it's a true 50, so you introduce a pure maybe, you introduce some uncertainty, notice what happens to the dopamine level. Because you see, the brain has been designed not to miss anything, and when it doesn't know what happens next, it will stay there, and it will stay there. What do you think gambling behavior does? What do you think alcoholism does? Is you just don't know, maybe the next moment is going to give you that hit that you're after. Maybe the next moment I'm going to stay with it a little more and a little bit more. So see, including a specific amount of uncertainty, not making everything so obvious, can help your messages, because the brain will want to stay with you. And by the way, if you take all those away, the reward, the anticipation, and the uncertainty, we can't aspire at that much action. We can't aspire at people moving towards us. So how do you include these segments in the way that you communicate with others? Go for it.
What if it goes, uncertainty goes higher, not higher? Does it go down?
It definitely goes down, because after a while you will give up because you're not getting the reward. I like what he's asking in terms of what if uncertainty goes so much up that now you really are your prediction is that this is not going to happen. By now it's not happening. You know who's training our brains in a weird way is some retailers. Do you ever shop online and put something in your cart but don't buy it? What happens next? You get a message saying, hey, by the way, you forgot something in your cart. And quite often some retailers will say in a day or so, here's a 10% off coupon. So that now they entice you to perform the action. So they habituate your brains with that reward, so that next time that you're shopping on that site, you think, I'm going to put it there, but I'm not going to buy it because surely they're going to give me an incentive. And some people cleverly give that reward, and sometimes they don't. And that's why you keep on buying, because you're thinking, oh, maybe this time I'm going to get it. Oh, maybe this time it's going to happen. Because in some capacity, you're all leaders in here. Surely you want to get people to move towards you. True and false is only temporary pleasure. And that's why I loved her question about simplicity, because simplicity will only get you that far. At some point, the brain will crave that complexity. At some point, we want to move beyond true and false. And at some point, we want to move beyond one message with 3 supporting points, and we want more. When we share something that's more complex with your audiences, you increase the chances of them building memory traces anyway. So don't feel like the entire segment that you're sharing has to be simple. Simple is only the main message that you want them to retain with some supporting points, but after a while, the brain is craving some complexity. Besides, simplicity after a while is a snoozer, so I'm very glad that you remarked that. The brain enjoys the simplicity, however, because of the cognitive ease, so you have to give it at some point, but do not sacrifice your complexity, rather manage it well. Besides, your audience's brains are not even going to appreciate your efforts to simplify, because it does take an effort to get to the clarity, unless they know the complexity from which it has come from. I'll say this again, your audiences are not going to appreciate your efforts to offer a simple message unless they know the complexity from which that has come. So make sure that you show the contrast, just like we were doing with familiarity versus surprise. Now we're talking about simplicity versus complexity. Just make sure that you create some of these segments. Sometimes I get the question, well, for uncertainty, surely, especially in business, we want to make everything clear, we want to make things obvious. But don't think that it always has to be the case. Give people alternatives, or give them the sense of discovery. Allow them to figure something out for themselves. Imagine your communication as a clothesline. If you're covering that entire clothesline 100%, that's definitely a snoozer, that's boring. But if you cover it only 60% or 70%, and you allow people to meet you somewhere, and you're creating a small amount of uncertainty, and I'm saying it's small because you don't want to jar the brain too much, like he was saying, we don't want to have too much uncertainty. it will work out because you have a heightened sense of attention. So let's prove it, because so far you have been listening to me, you have seen some slides that are displaying here. I'm going to ask you to join me in an exercise before we go. I'd love for you to grab your phones, I know that you really want to, and take a picture of your shoes, and as you email it to me, you can see my email address here on the screen. Attach 2 or 3 sentences of the story that your shoes could share. Maybe they have seen an amazing place. Maybe they have witnessed something they shouldn't have. Maybe they have heard something unusual. Your shoes have been somewhere before they came here. Tell us their story, and I'll switch from my slides to your examples, and I'll share a few. So let's take exactly a minute and 17 seconds, and capture your picture, send me a few sentences of your shoe stories, and let's see where they have taken you. I'm very excited to get your examples. A minute and 17 seconds. I'm going to set an alarm for us. Since then, they have been to Arroyo Seco, Death Valley, and countless places. Notice it's one clean, one dirty, because I wanted to test out different soap on the other. Oh, that's beautiful. We'll do one more. It's hard to get away from these. My blue suede shoes were on my funky feet on my first naughty visit ever to a nightclub. There's a naughty visit. These shoes might have some other stories to show, so make sure you check out Josh. Because you might be surprised. Are we getting close to closing? Well, thank you so much for sharing these stories, and I guarantee that as we're looking at these, let's see if these are coming up. I have been running this exercise for quite some time, and by now I think I have easily about 2,000 shoes. But notice how when we do this exercise, something happens in the room because we're implementing that element of uncertainty. None of us here have any clue of what's about to come next. And notice some other stories that I have gathered in the past, how much of an emotional connection, you're talking about the emotions, are enabling for us as you're reading some of this. Notice this one here. Very much, I like the one that you sent in where you took your shoes off. A lot of these are very touching. Somebody was paying attention to that question. The projector is not doing justice to some of these pictures, but there is one leg missing, so you can sense the touching factor in that story. Same here. Yeah, exactly. So they generate a reaction. They make us participate, and these are all brilliant. These are all brilliant people who have submitted these. And we react in some way as you're reading them. So the advice that I have for you as you're reflecting on your own content, make sure that you allow some segment where people can meet you, where you allow some segment where their brilliance can emerge. And that element of, even though it's uncertainty, the reason that the brain stays is because we all want to know what happens next. I'll end with these 2 elements that you'll find satisfying to apply in your own content. One is in terms of satisfaction and matching people's expectations and giving them the reward that they're after. Because one of the reasons we're not memorable is because memory is motivated and it's constantly looking for rewards. We're willing to perform that motion if we feel we're going to get rewarded. There was an experiment that was done also at UC Berkeley where Mr. Poland teaches. And the experiment would go like this. This researcher, his name is Otto Tinklepaw. Imagine that being your name. Otto Tinklepaw would take these monkeys and he would put one at a time in a chair in a room, and the monkey would observe the researcher hide the piece of lettuce under one of the 2 cups in the room. And the researcher would be curious to know how long would it take the monkey to go out of the room, come back, and go directly to where the lettuce was hidden. And on average, it would take the monkey about 2 minutes to go out, come back, and go directly to the lettuce and eat it really fast because it found it rewarding. So Mr. Otto Tinklepaw would repeat this experiment for about 2 months, and after a while, he did something different. In one of the sessions, the monkey would come into the room, go to the cup, lift it up, and instead of finding the lettuce, he found a banana, which of course now given the rewards, of course he prefers the banana compared to the lettuce. So he would repeat this experiment for 2 more months, so each time that the monkey comes back, he knows where to find the hidden banana. And after 2 more months, Mr. Otto Tinklepaw did something mean. In one of the instances, the monkey comes back into the room, goes to the cup, lifts it up, and what does it find? It finds the lettuce. And he gets all confused. He looks under the other cup. He looks at the researcher. He looks under the chair. He starts getting aggressive with the chair, then with the researcher. And he leaves the room refusing to eat the lettuce, which months ago was so rewarding. So the question that I have for all of us as we reflect on the content that we want to influence others with, are you giving people lettuce when they expect bananas? Make sure that you meet people at their expected level of reward, regardless of how high that is, because sometimes you may be talking to very sophisticated people, very much like I'm talking to you right now. You're very sophisticated people. That's why you would choose to come to events like these. And make sure that you meet them even at the highest level. I'm learning a lot from this show, and I'm sure that everybody here in the room knows about this show. What you may not know is that its creators boast degrees from Ivy League schools, such as PhDs in physics from Yale and math from Harvard. These people are very smart, and they don't skimp on the simplicity that she was talking about and the intelligence. Sometimes they find ways to sprinkle in these shows something that can appeal even to a PhD level of a viewer. So they don't just appeal to rewards for adolescents or for kids. They can appeal to rewards for the highest level of intellect. That's our finishing time for the exercise. So in one show, you can see this multiple choice question at a baseball game, Margie's at a baseball game. And you know the Jumbotron? This multiple choice question shows for just a few split seconds. Is anybody into math here? Any math buff? A few-ish. So as you're looking at these numbers, does anybody recognize these numbers? Because they're just, for us average mortals, these would be just nice numbers and a cutesy thing to do at a baseball game. But there is significance behind these. So the first number is considered a perfect number. Math has a few of these, about 100 of them. What's a perfect number? If you take all the numbers that this number is divisible by and you add them all together, you end up with the original number. So that's a perfect number. The second number is considered a narcissistic number. And what's a narcissistic number? You count the number of digits. In this case, it's 4 digits. You raise each digit to the power of 4. And then you add up all the numbers again, and you end up with the original number. So because the number can recreate itself from itself, it suggests that it's in love with itself, and therefore it's a narcissistic number. The third one is a number that matches a Mersenne prime. Mersenne was a 17th century mathematician who was studying prime, and that number matches something that a formula that he was studying. So you see, for just a few split seconds, these people are appealing to the highest level of reward. And that's the aspiration that I have for all of you. Don't dumb down your complexity, rather manage it well. And when you combine it with a modicum of uncertainty and surprise, that's when you have people paying a heightened sense of attention. And if you have attention, you have memory. If you have memory, you're more likely to get people to decide in your favor. So there we have it. You can email me. I have my email address already. I can send you a handout for this. If you're ever fascinated by brain science in general, come and join us in one of our workshops. But overall, just use any and all of these principles, because when you make memory your mission, and when you realize that it is indeed making the world move, then you'll have more chances to get people to act in your favor and indeed go through that effort to move your way. Thank you so much for inviting me. Back to you. Thank you, everyone.